I want to begin this way, and I'm going to say very little, and then introduce our panelists who will speak in alphabetical order. We had originally planned on 15 minutes apiece. I think we're going to cut that, if we can, to 12 minutes apiece, and then allow time for, if we have any time, for questioning. I just want to start this way. This is a quotation from September 25th, 2003, from a certain congressman who said, I do not want the same kind of focus and safety and soundness that we have in the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Office of Thrift Supervision. I want to roll the dice a little bit more in this situation towards subsidized housing. And of course, Barney Frank got his wish and has been now conducting investigations to try to figure out how the housing bubble burst and why the mortgage industry in the United States is in total freefall. And it reminds me that there is a truth in Washington, and the congressman told me this, actually the congressman I was sitting next to on the House Ethics Committee whispered this to me after I kept getting voted down to get subpoenas. And he said to me, he said, and it was Dick Cheney, and he said, hey, Ray, in Congress, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you place the blame. And so today, our topic is whether we should blame the financial crisis on the failure of the regulatory agencies in the financial area. And there are four areas: the securities regulation, notably the SEC, and commodities, futures, CFTC, banking. There are a number of agencies, and then insurance, and there are very few federal agencies. Our first speaker, and you have the bios, so I'll just generally point out their biographies. And the first speaker is Professor Miller, who is the Comfort Professor at NYU Law School, nationally recognized expert in banking, financial institutions, been a visiting professor and consultant at various and sundry universities and around the world. Professor Miller.
Thank you very much. Maybe I could start out with a theme that Judge Randolph just mentioned, the apparent failure of the regulators to prevent or adequately deal with, at the beginning at least, the crisis that happened and broke on us like a Category 5 hurricane in September of 2008. Arguably a huge failure of the bureaucracy and of the systems for control of the bureaucracy. So the SEC, wonderful agency, Harvey, but didn't really identify or control the risk of the subprime mortgage securities. The bank agencies really failed to understand the risk that housing finance and other speculative investments posed for banks. The Fed, a complete failure to recognize the looming threat to our financial system. Abroad, equal failures. The European Central Bank was no better than the Fed at identifying the problems that were out there. There's an institution in Basel called the Financial Stability Forum, whose whole objective was to identify problems and threats for the world's financial system. They completely failed to identify the problems of the housing bubble. So there's a massive, massive breakdown of our system of regulatory control, oversight, and supervision, a systemic breakdown, and something that ought to make us go back to the drawing board to some extent, to rethink the strategies that we've used in the past to control administrative action, especially in the financial services field. So the conventional approach to control of the bureaucracy has been judicialized. The idea is that judges ought to look at administrative agencies and, where appropriate, insist that they adopt proper procedures or evaluate their decisions as to whether they're arbitrary, capricious, or an abuse of discretion. Well, that works in some settings, but completely fails to address the kinds of problems that broke out in 2008. No amount of judicial control of agency action would have prevented or mitigated, in my opinion, in any respect, the disaster that happened last year. Furthermore, the breakdown in oversight and analysis was systematic. That is, all agencies of the government were prone to similar problems, so no amount of oversight of one agency, the courts or otherwise, over another agency would have solved the problem because they were all subject to the problem. So, what to do? What can we think about here? Review of the crisis suggests, to me at least, the presence of an important and imperfectly understood systematic risk that hasn't been thoroughly identified to date. And I call this intellectual hazard. So what's intellectual hazard? It's the tendency of conceptual biases in complex institutions to interfere with the analysis of information pertinent to risk. The compilation of the information, the analysis of the information, the communication of information, and acting on information pertinent to risk. I sometimes think of this by way of an analogy to the failed NASA Mars orbiter space mission. You may not remember this, but a few years ago, NASA sent a satellite up to Mars with the purpose of identifying climate conditions in Mars. It got to Mars, it did a thrust to go into orbit, disappeared behind Mars, and never reappeared. What happened to it? Well, NASA went back and did an investigation, and it found out that there were two teams designed tasks with the responsibility of managing the guidance of this satellite. One team turned out to have been working in feet, and the other team turned out to have been working in meters. They never communicated this to each other, and as a result, the burn was too great, the satellite entered the atmosphere too low, and apparently burned up. So this is an example of how a complex organization can make fundamental, elementary mistakes. It seems like something like that might have happened in the financial crisis, some type of intellectual hazard in which fundamental mistakes were made, not only by the government, but also by many in the private sector, and I have to admit, many in my industry of academics, both lawyers and economists, business academics. Hardly anybody recognized the kind of threat that we had. So this intellectual hazard, in my opinion, is a type of systemic risk. It's like moral hazard in that respect, and like moral hazard also in that it has a kind of a pro-cyclical effect. That is, when we're in boom times, when things are going well, everybody gets swept up in the boom. Everybody gets excited. And their excitement, their enthusiasm, the selection of optimists in various organizations leads to the tide going up, and all the ships go up during this boom time because people begin to think about risk in a different way, an erroneous way, but a different way. Then, of course, after the crisis, when we're on the downside, the same thing happens in reverse, and we get an accentuation of the negative, again due to erroneous or biased assessment of risk in complex organizations. So just a few examples of how this worked. So the Fed. Now the Fed, there are many explanations for what happened, and people will be debating the events of 2008 for a very long time. But there's some degree of consensus, at least, even among people at the Fed, that the Fed made a policy error in putting so much credit into the US and world markets during the decade of the 2000s. It flooded the market with credit and kept interest rates at a very low rate. The effect of that, arguably, was to inflate the housing bubble, to encourage firms, especially financial firms, to greatly increase their leverage because credit was so cheap, and to encourage firms to lever up with short-term rather than long-term credit because short-term rates were much lower than long-term rates. All of those things, of course, contributing to the instability in markets that descended on us in 2008.